Vikings took the wives of their enemies, history's most horrifying secret. Tonight, we dive into one of the darkest, least discussed truths of the Viking Age. Not the battles, not the ships, but what happened after the fighting stopped. Subscribe to Throne of Scandals, and let's dive deep into what Vikings did with wives of defeated warriors. Believe me, it's worse than death. The year is 865. The great heathen army lands on English shores, their longships slicing through the fog. Villages along the coast catch fire one after another. For most, the terror wasn't just in losing the battle, it was in what came after. When Viking warbands swept through Britain, Ireland, and the coasts of Eastern Europe, they didn't just take gold and weapons, they took people. Men who resisted were often killed. Women and children were captured and brought to the ships, part of what the Norse called the booty of war. For centuries, this side of Viking life was softened in popular stories. We heard of explorers, traders, and brave warriors. Hidden beneath that legend was a system that turned human beings into property. The Vikings built an empire not just with swords and sails, but through a vast trade in human lives. Archaeologists have uncovered this truth piece by piece. In the soil of Old Dublin, once a Viking stronghold, they found iron shackles and wooden pens large enough to hold hundreds of people. Dublin wasn't just a port, it was one of the biggest slave markets in medieval Europe. From here, people captured in Ireland, Scotland, and England were sold across the Norse world to Scandinavia, the Baltic. Even as far as the markets of Byzantium and the Abbasid Caliphate. Contemporary records prove it. The Annals of Ulster describe raids where a great multitude of men and women were led away into captivity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions whole towns emptied after Viking attacks. Monks wrote these lines in trembling hands, trying to record what they had seen before it was forgotten. In Norse law, these captives became thralls, slaves with no rights. They could be bought, sold, or traded like livestock. But some were taken north for another purpose, to build the next generation of Norse families. Viking society was structured around households and inheritance. A powerful man could have one lawful wife and several lesser partners or household women. Some of these relationships were arranged through alliance and trade. Others were not. The sagas use simple words: taken, given, brought home. But those words cover a world of suffering and coercion. The sagas and law codes rarely judged it. The Viking world was ruled by strength, not sympathy. The idea of personal freedom applied only to those born into it. Everyone else could be claimed through force. Over time, these captives changed the face of the Norse world. When scientists studied the DNA of early Icelandic settlers, they found something unexpected. The majority of female genetic lines came not from Scandinavia, but from the British Isles. Irish, Scottish, and Welsh ancestry woven into the bloodline of the Viking Age. That discovery rewrote history. Iceland's founders weren't just Norse explorers and their families, they were Norse men and the women they carried from conquered lands. Every generation afterward carried both lineages, a living record of conquest hidden in the body itself. The sagas preserve hints of these stories. In Laxadila Saga, an Irish woman named Melkorka is captured and brought to Iceland. Never speaks of her past, only whispers that she was once a king's daughter. Her son later becomes a respected man, but the saga never forgets where his mother came from. The story is presented as legend, but DNA evidence tells us it wasn't fiction. It was common. The same pattern appears across Scandinavia. Place names trace the roots of captives who became part of Norse households. Artifacts show cultural blending. Celtic brooches found in Viking graves, Norse jewelry engraved with Christian crosses. Every piece tells the same story. Cultures colliding under duress, merging through necessity, not choice. To the Vikings, this blending was a mark of success. Raid didn't just bring treasure, it brought labor, wives, and children who tied conquered lands to their new rulers. In a brutal way, it was a strategy of empire building long before the word existed. But even within that system, traces of humanity remained. Some women, once enslaved, later earned freedom or influence. Norse law allowed a freed thrall to marry and inherit property. There are cases in the Icelandic records where the children of such unions became respected landowners. The past is rarely clean. Even in the darkest corners, life found ways to adapt. Modern historians estimate that during the peak of Viking expansion, tens of thousands of people were displaced across northern Europe. Some were sold into the Islamic world, others disappeared into the cold farms of Scandinavia. Very few left their own words behind. Their stories survived only through the fragments of others, the sagas, the chronicles, and the bones buried in mixed soil. For centuries later, generations romanticized the Viking Age, the horns on helmets, the fearless explorers, the ships sailing to the edge of the world. But the real picture is more complicated. The same civilization that carved poetry into stone also built its wealth on human suffering. This wasn't unique to the Vikings. Slavery existed across medieval Europe and the Islamic world. But the Norse raids industrialized it. They turned warfare into a pipeline of human capture that connected entire continents. The trade stretched from the icy fjords of Norway to the hot markets of Baghdad. A captive taken in an Irish village might find herself years later serving in a Persian household, carrying with her a language, a name, and a story that no one recorded. Even the word slave itself traces back to this era. It comes from Slav, the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe, who were frequently captured by Scandinavian raiders and sold abroad. Their fate became so common that their name became the universal term for human bondage. Every culture tells its past as a legend. The Norse were no different. They sang of heroes, of Odin and Valhalla, of glory and battle. But their sagas rarely mentioned the shadows that followed the warriors home, the captives who built their farms, raised their children, and shaped their bloodlines. In recent years, archaeologists have begun to fill those gaps. Graves once thought to hold family members sometimes contain people of foreign origin buried without markers. Ship burials reveal a mix of cultural artifacts, Celtic beads beside Norse axes, Slavic ornaments beside Scandinavian combs. Each discovery chips away at the myth of pure conquest and reveals a more complex, more human truth. The Viking world was both brutal and brilliant, connected distant lands, opened trade routes, and reshaped Europe. But it also carried within it one of history's most horrifying secrets, that its strength was built, in part on the captivity and forced integration of others. When we look back on the Viking Age, it's easy to see only the glory, the shining swords, the roaring halls, the endless sea voyages. But somewhere behind those scenes were countless lives uprooted and absorbed. Their names lost, but their legacy carved into the very DNA of nations. In every Icelandic family tree that traces back to a Norse settler, there's a silent branch, the line of someone taken, someone forgotten, someone whose story ended before it began. That's the part history rarely tells. Not the conquests, but the consequences. The Vikings didn't just change the map of Europe, they changed its people. They built bridges between cultures through fear and force. And in doing so, they left behind a legacy both magnificent and monstrous. Today, when we celebrate Viking heritage, it's worth remembering the full story, the courage and the cruelty, the voyages and the victims. Because history's most horrifying secrets are often the ones that built the world we live in. Subscribe to Throne of Scandals for more real stories and dark truths history tried to bury.